High in the Colorado Rockies, where winter storms can kill in minutes, 16-year-old Cole had built something the other mountain families called plain stupid, a deliberate gap in his cabin's north wall that seemed to invite the killing cold inside. When the Weather Service issued warnings about the worst blizzard in 50 years, Cole's neighbors laughed at his broken cabin while sealing their own homes tight as drums. But Cole wasn't just any mountain boy. Raised by his Cherokee grandmother before she passed, he carried knowledge that stretched back centuries, secrets about how the mountain itself could become your ally if you knew how to listen. As temperatures plummeted to 40 below and furnaces failed throughout the valley, something impossible was happening inside Cole's cabin. While his neighbors' homes turned into ice boxes despite their modern heating systems, Cole's strange wall gap was creating warmth that defied every law of physics they knew. What ancient technique had his grandmother taught him that could turn a hole in the wall into a lifeline? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mockery had started the day Cole moved back to the mountain after his grandmother's funeral. He'd inherited her small plot of land halfway up Whistling Ridge, where the wind never stopped and the snow fell 8 months of the year. At 16, most folks figured he'd either sell the property or freeze to death trying to make it work. Instead, Cole had spent 3 months building a cabin with his own hands, using techniques his grandmother had shown him during their long walks through the forest. She'd called it the old teaching, ways of building and living that her ancestors had perfected over generations of surviving in impossible places. Tom Brennan, whose family had lived in these mountains for 4 generations, had been the first to notice the gap. "Boy's got a hole in his wall big enough to throw a cat through," he'd told anyone who'd listened down at Murphy's General Store. "Kid's gonna freeze solid come first snow." Sarah Chen, who ran the local weather station, had tried to help. She'd driven up the winding dirt road with a truck full of insulation and modern heating equipment. "Cole, honey," she'd said, standing in his doorway and eyeing the rectangular opening that seemed to stare out at the mountain like a window without glass. "This isn't safe. Let me help you fix this properly." But Cole had politely declined, just as he'd declined every offer of help that followed. He knew how it looked. A skinny kid with dark hair and quiet ways, living alone in a cabin that seemed designed to kill him. What they couldn't see was the careful intention behind every beam, every stone, every seemingly random detail his grandmother's voice still whispered to him in dreams. "The mountain breathes," she'd told him once, when he was 12 and struggling to understand why they built their hunting shelters differently than everyone else. "You fight the mountain, you lose. You work with the mountain, you live." Now, as Cole stood in his warm cabin watching snow pile 3 feet deep against his windows, her words made perfect sense. The gap in his north wall wasn't a mistake. It was the most important feature of the entire structure. Outside, the wind howled with a fury that made the walls shake. But inside, despite having no furnace, no electric heat, and no modern insulation, Cole sat comfortably in his flannel shirt, watching the storm through the very gap his neighbors had mocked. The secret lay not in the gap itself, but in what his grandmother had taught him about airflow, thermal dynamics, and the mountain's own hidden patterns. The opening was positioned precisely to catch the wind at a specific angle, channeling it through a series of stone passages Cole had built beneath his cabin's floor. As the air moved through these carefully designed channels, the earth itself warmed it, while the unique shape of the passages created a circulation system that pulled warm air up through vents near his fireplace and pushed cold air out through other hidden openings. It was a heating system older than recorded history, one that used the mountain's own thermal mass and the storm's own energy to create warmth. The harder the wind blew, the better it worked. A sharp crack echoed across the valley, the sound of a tree falling, probably onto power lines. Cole's battery radio crackled to life with emergency broadcasts. Temperatures were dropping faster than predicted. Power was out across 3 counties. Emergency shelters were opening in town for anyone who could make it down the mountain roads, though most were already impassable. Cole added another log to his small fire, not because he needed the heat, but because he enjoyed watching the flames dance. Outside, his neighbors were likely burning furniture to stay alive, assuming their chimneys hadn't already frozen solid. Tomorrow, if they survived, they'd want answers, and Cole would have to decide how much of his grandmother's ancient wisdom he was ready to share with people who had spent months calling him a fool. The mountain, it seemed, was about to teach them all a lesson about the difference between knowledge and understanding. The morning after the storm brought an eerie silence that seemed to press against the mountainside like a held breath. Martha Hendricks stood at her kitchen window, coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared across the valley toward Cole's property. The snow had finally stopped, leaving behind drifts that reached nearly to the eaves of some cabins. She couldn't shake the image of that strange gap in Cole's wall, the way the wind had seemed to sing through it during the worst of the storm. Her husband Tom had called the boy foolish more times than she could count, but something about last night nagged at her, the way their own cabin had groaned and shuddered, while Cole's had stood silent as a church. "You're brooding again," Tom said, stomping snow off his boots as he came through the door. He'd been out checking their generator, which had given up the ghost sometime around midnight. "That boy's probably frozen solid by now. Should have listened when we tried to help him." Martha turned from the window. His lights were still on this morning. Impossible. Everyone lost power. Even the Mackenzies' place went dark, and they've got the best setup on the mountain. But Martha had seen it herself, a soft, warm glow emanating from Cole's windows, while every other cabin sat dark and cold. She pulled on her heavy coat and boots, ignoring Tom's protests as she stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The trek to Cole's cabin took twice as long as usual, but something drove her forward through the drifts. As she got closer, she could hear something that made her stop and listen. Music. Someone was playing a guitar, and smoke was rising from Cole's chimney in a steady, confident stream. She knocked on the door, and it opened almost immediately. Cole stood there in a flannel shirt and jeans, looking as comfortable as if it were a spring morning. Behind him, she could see his cabin was warm and well lit, with no sign of the devastation that had struck every other home on the mountain. "Mrs. Hendricks," Cole said, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness she'd grown used to hearing from him. "Come in. You look frozen." The interior of the cabin was impossibly cozy. Oil lamps provided gentle illumination, and the fire crackled with steady warmth. But it was something else that caught her attention, a subtle movement of air that seemed to flow through the space in a deliberate pattern. "How?" was all she managed to say. Cole gestured toward the gap in his wall that had caused so much gossip. "My grandfather's design. He called it a wind gate." Martha moved closer to examine it. The gap was precisely cut, angled in a way that seemed random but clearly wasn't. As she watched, she could see how the wind from outside was being channeled through it, creating a current that moved through the cabin in a specific pattern. "It's a pressure relief system," Cole explained, bringing her a cup of hot coffee. "During storms like last night, the wind pressure builds up around a structure. Most cabins fight against it, and eventually something gives way, a window, part of the roof, sometimes an entire wall. But this gap bleeds off the pressure gradually, in a controlled way." Martha stared at the ingenious design. "But the heat loss actually creates a convection current that improves heating efficiency." Cole pointed to carefully placed vents and baffles she hadn't noticed before. "The cold air comes in low and fast, gets heated immediately by the fire, and circulates through the cabin before being pulled out through the upper vents. It's like having a built-in circulation system." She thought about her own cabin, how they'd sealed every crack and gap to keep the cold out, how stuffy and uneven the heating always was. And the power? Cole showed her a series of small wind turbines positioned near the wind gate, so cleverly disguised within the cabin's structure that they were nearly invisible from outside. The controlled airflow drives these generators. The stronger the wind outside, the more power I generate. Last night's storm charged my batteries to full capacity. Martha felt something like awe creeping over her. Why didn't you tell us? When everyone was saying you'd made a mistake, would you have believed me? Cole's voice was gentle but pointed. Or would you have thought I was making excuses for shoddy construction? She knew the answer, and it shamed her. The community had been so certain of their modern improvements, their faith in conventional building wisdom, that they dismissed what they didn't understand. My grandfather lived through 73 winters in a cabin with this same design, Cole continued. He tried to teach the techniques to others, but people thought he was just a stubborn old man clinging to outdated ways. Through the window, Martha could see smoke beginning to rise from other cabins as their owners struggled to restore heat and power. She thought of Tom, probably still cursing their failed generator, and felt a deep unease settle in her chest. There's more, isn't there? She asked. Other things your grandfather taught you? Cole's expression grew serious. Much more. And given what I'm seeing in the weather patterns, we're going to need every bit of it. The storm hit 3 days later with a fury that even the oldest residents hadn't seen in decades. Cole stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow fall in thick, angry sheets that turned the world into a white void. The wind howled like something alive and wounded, rattling every board in his small cabin. He'd spent the morning reinforcing his shutters and checking his supplies, but his eyes kept drifting to that peculiar gap in the wall. Something about it nagged at him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The weathered wood around it showed signs of deliberate shaping, as if someone had carefully carved out that exact space for a specific purpose. By afternoon, the temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels. Cole's breath misted inside the cabin despite the fire crackling in his stone hearth. He pulled on another sweater and added more logs to the flames, but the cold seemed to seep through every crack and crevice in the old structure. That's when he noticed something odd. While frost formed on every other surface in the cabin, the area around the mysterious gap remained clear. Not only that, but he could feel the faintest whisper of warmth emanating from the opening. Curious, he knelt beside it and held his hand near the space. Definitely warmer air. Cole grabbed a flashlight and peered through the gap. The beam illuminated something unexpected. Not the exterior wall he'd assumed was there, but a hollow space that seemed to extend into the mountain itself. The warm air was rising from somewhere below, carrying with it the faint scent of minerals and deep earth. A natural hot spring. The cabin had been built over a geothermal vent. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory. That cabin's got secrets, boy. Old Henrik knew what he was doing when he built it. As the storm intensified, Cole began to understand. The gap wasn't a sign of poor craftsmanship. It was a carefully designed heating system. The original builder had known about the underground warm spring and had created a way for that heated air to circulate into the living space. The seemingly random placement of the opening was actually positioned to maximize the flow of warm air while preventing downdrafts from the chimney. Meanwhile, across the valley, his neighbors were discovering that their modern, well-insulated homes weren't quite as prepared for this level of cold as they'd believed. Tom Bradley's propane heater sputtered and died when the gas line froze. Sarah Chen's electric heating system failed when a tree branch took down the power lines. The Kowalski family huddled around their fireplace, burning furniture when their firewood ran out faster than expected. But Cole's cabin remained warm. As night fell, the temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero. The wind picked up, creating whiteout conditions that made venturing outside potentially fatal. Cole settled into his rocking chair with a book, comfortable in his shirt sleeves, while the ancient heating system his great-great-grandfather had dismissed as that fool gap kept him safe from the killing cold. Around midnight, he heard something over the wind, a faint pounding. Someone was at his door. Cole opened it to find Tom Bradley, nearly hypothermic and barely able to stand. Snow clung to his eyebrows and beard like white moss. "My heat's out," Tom gasped through chattering teeth. "Pipes are freezing. Can't feel my fingers anymore." Without hesitation, Cole pulled his neighbor inside. Tom's eyes widened as the warmth hit him. "How is it so warm in here? Your cabin's older than dirt." "Sometimes old dirt knows what it's doing," Cole replied, wrapping a blanket around Tom's shoulders and guiding him to a chair near the mysterious gap. "Sit here. This is the warmest spot." Over the next few hours, more neighbors arrived. The Kowalskis, then Sarah Chen, each nearly frozen and desperate. Cole's small cabin became a refuge, and everyone gathered around that peculiar opening in the wall that had been the subject of so much ridicule. "I don't understand," Sarah murmured, holding her hands over the gap. "How does this even work?" Cole explained what he'd discovered about the geothermal vent and the deliberate design of the opening. The room fell silent except for the wind outside and the gentle flow of warm air from the earth below. "Henrik Larsson built this place in 1887, Tom said quietly. Man barely spoke English, but he'd lived in Norway. Probably knew more about surviving mountain winters than all of us combined." They spent the rest of the storm in Cole's cabin, sharing stories and resources while the ancient heating system kept them all alive. By the time the weather cleared 3 days later, something had shifted in their small communities' understanding of wisdom and foolishness. The gap in the wall had saved their lives, and none of them would forget it. The storm hit 3 days later with the fury of something alive and vengeful. Cole watched from his cabin window as the first fat snowflakes began to fall, each one seeming to hesitate in the air before committing to its descent. By afternoon, those lazy flakes had transformed into a horizontal assault of white that made the world beyond his porch disappear entirely. He'd been through mountain storms before, but this one carried a different weight. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed with a voice that seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze. When he pressed his face to the glass, he could barely make out the outline of Garrett's cabin 50 yards away, and that was only when the wind shifted just right. The radio crackled with emergency warnings until it finally gave up altogether, leaving only static that sounded eerily like the storm itself. Cole checked his supplies, enough food for a week, water, firewood stacked high against the far wall. He'd learned preparation from his grandfather, who'd survived the legendary blizzard of '78 by thinking ahead rather than hoping for the best. As darkness fell, the temperature began its real descent. Cole could feel it creeping through the walls despite the fire burning steadily in his hearth. He pulled on an extra sweater and settled into his reading chair, trying to focus on a worn paperback novel, but the storm's voice kept pulling his attention away. Something about its rhythm felt wrong, almost like it was building toward something worse. Around midnight, a sharp crack echoed through the cabin, different from the constant groaning of wind-stressed timber. Cole set down his book and listened. Another crack, then a sound like giant footsteps on his roof. He grabbed his flashlight and checked the windows, but saw only swirling white chaos illuminated briefly before being swallowed again. The third crack was followed by a tremendous crash that shook the entire structure. Cole's coffee mug tumbled from the side table, shattering on the wooden floor. Outside, he could hear something large settling, creaking under its own weight. A tree, he realized, probably the massive pine that had stood sentinel beside his cabin for longer than he'd been alive. When he tried the light switch, nothing happened. The power lines were down. Working by flashlight, he investigated the cabin's interior. The main beam above the living area had shifted slightly, and there was a new sag in the roof line that definitely hadn't been there that morning. Snow was beginning to find its way through gaps that the falling tree had opened up, tiny white fingers reaching into his warm sanctuary. But the most concerning discovery was in the back bedroom. The fallen pine had struck the cabin at an angle, crushing part of the rear wall and creating an opening to the outside world that was letting in both wind and snow at an alarming rate. The temperature in that room was already approaching the freezing point, and cold air was flowing through the cabin like water finding its level. Cole worked quickly, dragging furniture and supplies away from the affected area. He tried hanging blankets over the opening, but the wind simply tore them away or rendered them useless within minutes. The cold was advancing through his home like an invading army, and his fire, though still burning strong, was losing the battle against the sudden influx of Arctic air. He estimated he had maybe 2 hours before the entire cabin would be too cold to survive in. The thought of venturing outside in this storm was tantamount to suicide, but staying was beginning to look equally fatal. His mind raced through possibilities, each one seeming more hopeless than the last. Then he remembered the gap. The foolish, impractical gap he'd left in his cabin wall, the one that had made Garrett laugh and prompted Sarah to question his sanity. It was on the opposite side of the cabin from the damage, protected from the storm's main assault by the angle of his roof and the natural windbreak of the surrounding trees. Cole grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the front wall, kneeling beside the seemingly purposeless opening. As he approached, he felt something that made him catch his breath, warm air. Not hot, not even truly warm, but noticeably warmer than the air flowing through the rest of the cabin. He placed his hand near the gap and felt a gentle current flowing inward. Somehow, despite all logic and modern understanding of how buildings should work, this opening wasn't letting cold air in. Instead, it seemed to be part of some larger system he didn't fully comprehend, moving air in a way that was actually helping to maintain the cabin's temperature. With growing excitement, Cole began to pay attention to the air currents throughout his home. The gap wasn't just a hole in the wall. It was part of a carefully designed ventilation system that his grandfather had understood but never fully explained. Even with the major breach in the back of the cabin, the gap was somehow helping to stabilize the air pressure and temperature in ways that defied his modern assumptions about building science. For the first time since the tree fell, Cole began to believe he might survive the night. The storm's fury intensified as darkness fell, transforming the mountain into a howling nightmare of ice and wind. Cole pressed his face against the frosted window, watching the snow swirl in violent spirals that made it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond his porch. The gap in his wall had begun its strange work hours ago, and now the sound it produced rose above even the storm's roar. It wasn't quite a whistle, nor exactly a moan, but something between the two that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the wind itself. The neighbors had stopped their mocking laughter when the real blizzard hit, but Cole knew they were still out there in their sealed, modern cabins, probably cursing his foolishness as the eerie sound drifted across the settlement. His grandfather's journal lay open on the kitchen table, its yellowed pages illuminated by the warm glow of the oil lamp. Cole had been reading the same passage over and over, trying to understand the cryptic words his grandfather had written decades ago. The mountain speaks to those who know how to listen. The gap calls to its own kind when the white death walks. A sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by a thunderous crash that shook Cole's cabin. Through his window, he saw sparks dancing in the darkness where the Hendersons' place should be. Their power line had snapped, and in this storm there would be no repair crews coming until it passed. Modern convenience had just become a liability. The sound from his wall grew more insistent, almost urgent now. Cole grabbed his heaviest coat and stepped onto his covered porch, immediately hit by the brutal cold despite the shelter. The wind tried to tear the breath from his lungs, but he pressed forward, following the sound that seemed to be calling out into the wilderness. Then he heard it, an answering call from somewhere far up the mountain. It was faint, nearly lost in the storm, but unmistakably similar to the sound coming from his cabin. Another gap, another deliberate opening carved into wood and stone by someone who understood what Cole was only beginning to grasp. His radio crackled to life inside the cabin, and he rushed back in to hear Martha Hendricks' panicked voice cutting through the static. "Anyone out there? Our heat's out, power's gone, and Jim's showing signs of hypothermia. The backup generator won't start. Please, if anyone can hear this." Cole grabbed the handset, his heart racing. The Hendricks lived in the most modern cabin in the settlement, all electric heating and sealed tight against the elements. "Martha, this is Cole. How long has your heat been out?" 20 minutes, maybe more. It's dropping fast in here, and the cold's getting to Jim real bad. His hands are white and he's not making much sense." 20 minutes without heat in weather like this could be deadly, especially for Jim, who was pushing 70 and had a weak heart. Cole looked at the gap in his wall, then at his grandfather's journal, understanding beginning to dawn on him like a cold sunrise. "Martha, you need to get over here, both of you, right now. Are you crazy? We can't go out in this storm. We can barely see our own front door." "Listen to me carefully," Cole said, his voice steady despite the urgency he felt. "Follow the sound from my cabin. Don't try to see where you're going. Just follow the sound. It'll guide you here." There was silence, except for the static. Then Martha's voice came back, strained and disbelieving. "Follow the sound. Cole, that noise has been driving us half mad for hours. How is that supposed to help?" "Trust me, Martha. That sound is designed to carry through storms like this. It's how people survived up here before modern heating and weather services. My grandfather knew what he was doing when he told me about that gap." Another long pause, then Jim's weak voice in the background saying something Cole couldn't make out. Martha came back on the radio, desperation clear in her tone. "We're coming. God help us, we're coming." Cole threw on his coat again and stepped back onto the porch, straining to see any sign of movement in the whiteout conditions. The sound from his wall continued its steady call, and he realized now that it wasn't random. It followed a pattern, a rhythm that would help lost travelers maintain direction even when they couldn't see their own feet. Minutes passed like hours before he finally saw two dark shapes stumbling through the snow, Martha supporting Jim as they followed the audible beacon his cabin provided. Cole rushed out to help them, and together they fought their way back to his door. As they collapsed inside, shivering and gasping, Martha looked around at Cole's warm, bright cabin with wonder and confusion. "How is your place so warm when ours turned into an icebox so fast?" Cole helped Jim to a chair near the wood stove and handed Martha a steaming mug of coffee. Outside, the storm raged on, but the gap in his wall continued its ancient song, calling out to anyone else who might need sanctuary in the mountain's deadly embrace. The wind's fury had reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. Cole pressed his ear against the cabin wall, listening to something beyond the storm's rage, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the unmistakable crack of splitting timber, followed by a woman's scream that cut through the howling air like a blade. Sarah Martinez was in trouble. He grabbed his heavy coat and the emergency rope he kept coiled by the door. The gap in his wall had been doing its work perfectly, the pressure differential keeping his cabin stable while others groaned and swayed. But now he had to venture into the teeth of the storm. The moment Cole stepped outside, the wind nearly drove him to his knees. Snow pelted his face like frozen bullets, and the cold bit through his layers within seconds. He could barely see 10 feet ahead, but years of living on this mountain had taught him to navigate by feel and instinct. The Martinez cabin was only 200 yards upslope, but it might as well have been miles in these conditions. Fighting against gusts that tried to hurl him off the narrow path, Cole made his way toward where he'd heard the scream. The snow was already knee-deep and climbing, each step a monumental effort. His lungs burned as he breathed the razor-sharp air, but he pressed on. Through the white chaos, he glimpsed the Martinez cabin, or what was left of it. The entire front porch had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. The support beams splintered like matchsticks. The main structure tilted at a dangerous angle, groaning with each wind gust as if it might fold completely at any moment. "Sarah!" Cole shouted, his voice nearly lost in the storm's roar. "Can you hear me?" A faint reply came from within the damaged cabin. She was alive, but trapped. Cole fought his way to what remained of the front entrance. The door hung askew, blocked by fallen timbers and debris. He could hear Sarah calling for help from somewhere inside, her voice tight with fear and pain. The cabin shuddered violently, and Cole realized it wouldn't stand much longer under the storm's assault. "Sarah, it's Cole. Where are you?" "Kitchen," came the muffled reply. "My legs pinned. The ceiling came down." Cole squeezed through the twisted doorframe, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as the cabin swayed. Inside, The devastation was worse than he'd imagined. Snow poured through gaping holes in the roof, and the main support beam had cracked nearly in half. The entire structure was moments from complete collapse. He found Sarah trapped beneath a section of fallen ceiling joists in what had been her kitchen. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, and her left leg was pinned under a heavy beam. Her face was pale with shock and cold. "Thank God," she whispered when she saw him. "I thought—" Another violent gust shook the cabin, and the walls groaned ominously. A shower of ice and debris fell from above. "We need to get you out of here now," Cole said, assessing the situation. The beam across Sarah's leg was too heavy to lift alone, but he might be able to create enough leverage to free her. He wedged a piece of broken timber under the beam and used it as a makeshift lever. "When I lift this, you pull your leg out fast. Ready?" Sarah nodded, gritting her teeth. Cole threw his weight against the lever, muscles straining. The beam rose just enough, and Sarah pulled herself free with a sharp cry of pain. Her leg was badly bruised but not broken. "Can you walk?" Cole asked, helping her to her feet. "I think so," she said, though she favored the injured leg heavily. The cabin lurched suddenly, the crack in the main beam spreading wider. They had seconds, not minutes. Cole wrapped his arm around Sarah's waist and half-carried her toward the ruined entrance. Behind them, the ceiling began to sag as another support gave way. They stumbled through the doorframe just as a thunderous crack split the air. The cabin folded in on itself like a house of cards, roof beams and walls collapsing into a twisted pile of debris. If they'd been inside even 10 seconds longer, they would have been crushed. But now they faced an equally deadly challenge, getting Sarah to safety in the storm. She could barely walk, and the wind seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Cole's own cabin was their only hope, but the journey back would test both their limits. He secured the rope around both their waists, creating a lifeline between them. "Stay close," he shouted over the wind. "Don't let go, no matter what happens." Sarah nodded, her face already numb with cold. They began the treacherous journey down the slope, each step a battle against the elements. The storm raged around them with prehistoric fury, as if the mountain itself had awakened in wrath. Cole had saved Sarah from the collapse, but now came the real test of survival. The wind had been howling for 3 hours when Martha Hensley first noticed the sound coming from Cole's cabin. Through the driving snow and her own frosted window, she could barely make out the dim glow of his oil lamp, but there was something else. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to pulse with the storm itself. "Harold," she called to her husband, who was stoking their fire for the 4th time since midnight. "You hear that?" Harold paused, poker in hand, and tilted his head toward the north wall of their cabin. The wind screamed around their eaves, rattling shutters and sending snow through every crack in their weathered logs, but underneath it all was that strange, almost musical drone. "Coming from the boys' place," Harold muttered, his breath visible in their rapidly cooling room. Their own fire was struggling against the downdrafts that kept forcing smoke back into the cabin. "What in blazes is he doing over there?" Across the small clearing, Emma Blackwood was having similar thoughts as she pressed another towel against the base of her door, where snow had begun forming small drifts inside her cabin. The temperature had plummeted so fast that ice was forming on the interior walls, and her fire seemed to be losing the battle against the cold. But Cole's cabin, there was something different about it tonight. The humming grew stronger as the storm intensified, and Emma realized it wasn't coming from Cole at all. It was coming from his cabin itself, from that ridiculous gap he'd left in the north wall that everyone had mocked him for. The same gap that had made them all question whether the boy had any sense at all about mountain living. Harold wrapped himself in a heavy coat and struggled to the window, scraping away the frost with his fingernails. What he saw made him step back in confusion. While snow was piling against every other structure in the valley, accumulating in drifts that threatened to bury doorways, the area around Cole's cabin seemed different. The wind patterns were wrong. The snow wasn't settling the way it should. "Martha, come look at this." His wife joined him at the window, squinting through the storm. Cole's cabin sat in what appeared to be a pocket of calmer air, snow swirling around it in strange eddies rather than the straight-line assault that was battering everything else. And that gap in the wall, the gap they'd all said would be his death, seemed to be the center of it all. The humming intensified, a deep resonance that Martha could feel in her bones. It reminded her of something, a half-remembered story from her grandmother about the old-timers who first settled these mountains. Something about reading the wind, about working with the storms instead of fighting them. Inside his cabin, Cole sat quietly by his fire, listening to the mountains speak. The gap in his wall had become a wind instrument of sorts, but more than that, it was a pressure valve, a carefully calculated opening that was redirecting the storm's fury around his small structure instead of against it. The humming was the sound of air moving through the gap at precise angles, creating a buffer zone that his great-grandfather's journal had described in weathered pages Cole had studied for months. The old man had written about the wind wisdom of the original mountain dwellers, how they'd learned to build not just shelter, but partnerships with the weather itself. The gap wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was an ancient technique that had been forgotten as newer building methods took over, as people began to think they could simply overpower the mountain instead of learning to dance with it. Emma's fire sputtered and nearly died as another downdraft forced smoke back into her cabin. She was wrapping herself in every blanket she owned when she noticed that the sound from Cole's place had changed. The humming had taken on a different pitch, almost like a song, and through her window she could see something that defied explanation. The storm was parting around Cole's cabin like water around a stone. Snow that should have been pounding against his north wall was being redirected up and over his roof, while the gap itself seemed to be breathing with the wind, inhaling and exhaling in rhythm with the storm's natural cycles. Harold grabbed his lantern and started toward the door, but Martha caught his arm. "You'll freeze to death out there." "Something's not right," he said. But even as he spoke, he wasn't sure if he meant something was wrong or if something was very, very right in a way that challenged everything he thought he knew about surviving mountain storms. The humming continued through the night, a constant reminder that the boy they'd all dismissed as foolish might understand something about these mountains that they'd forgotten. As their own fires struggled and their walls groaned under the storm's assault, Cole's cabin sang its ancient song, protected by knowledge that was older than memory and more reliable than modern common sense. The wind outside had grown from a howl to something that sounded like the mountain itself was screaming. Sarah pressed her face against the frosted window of the Hendersons' cabin, watching the snow whip horizontally across the clearing. What had started as a typical winter storm 3 hours ago had transformed into something she'd never seen before, a white wall of fury that seemed determined to erase everything in its path. "Temperatures dropping fast," Tom Henderson muttered, checking the thermometer by the door. 20 below and falling. Haven't seen it drop this quick since I was a boy." The cabin shuddered as another gust slammed into it, and Sarah noticed ice forming along the edges of the windows despite the fire crackling in the hearth. She counted 12 people crammed into the main room, neighbors who had taken refuge when their own homes proved inadequate against the storm's unexpected violence. The Kowalskis huddled near the fireplace with their twin toddlers, while old Pete Morrison sat in the corner, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "Fire's burning through wood faster than usual," Jim Kowalski observed, feeding another log into the flames. "This cold is something else." Sarah's thoughts turned to Cole, alone in his cabin just a quarter-mile away. She'd tried to reach him by radio an hour ago, but got only static, the same Cole they'd all been mocking just days before for that ridiculous gap he'd left in his wall. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here they were, refugees in someone else's home, while the man they'd called foolish was weathering this storm in his deliberately imperfect shelter. "We should try to reach Cole again," she suggested, moving toward the radio. Margaret Henderson looked up from where she was organizing their dwindling food supplies. "In this weather, you can barely see 10 feet out there. Besides, he's probably fine. That cabin of his has thick walls, even with that odd gap he insisted on leaving." That's exactly what worries me, Pete Morrison spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of his 80 years on this mountain. That gap might be the smartest thing any of us has done this winter. The room fell quiet, except for the wind's relentless assault. Sarah turned from the radio to look at the old man, noting the serious expression on his weathered face. "What do you mean?" Tom asked. Pete set down his mug and pointed toward the window. "Storm like this, temperature dropping so fast, creates pressure differences that can tear a building apart from the inside. Seen it happen twice in my lifetime. Cabins sealed up tight as drums, and then," he made a popping gesture with his hands, "roof comes right off, or walls buckle inward." "That's impossible," Jim scoffed. "These cabins are built solid. Mountain construction techniques have been proven for generations." "Mountain techniques, yes," Pete nodded slowly. "But which generation are you talking about? The one that learned from my grandfather's mistakes, or the one that forgot why certain things were done certain ways?" Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold seeping through the walls. "You're saying Cole knew something we didn't?" "I'm saying that boy might have remembered something the rest of us forgot. My grandfather used to tell stories about the winter of 1887. Storm came through, dropped 60 degrees in 4 hours. Every sealed building in 3 valleys lost their roofs. Only ones that survived had what folks called breathing holes, deliberate gaps that let the pressure equalize. The cabin groaned around them, and Sarah could swear she felt the walls shifting slightly. Through the window, she watched Cole's cabin in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. Even from here, she could see the warm glow of light in his windows, steady and undisturbed. "You think Cole actually knew about this?" Margaret asked, her voice uncertain now. "Or maybe," Pete continued, "he just listened when that gap appeared naturally and decided not to fight it. Sometimes the mountain tells you what it needs, and the smart ones pay attention instead of forcing their own ideas onto it." Another violent gust hit the cabin, and this time Sarah definitely felt the building shift. A cup rattled off the table, and one of the Kowalski twins started crying. "The radio," she said suddenly, moving toward it with renewed urgency. "We need to ask Cole about this. If Pete's right, if that gap is actually helping his cabin handle the pressure." She worked the radio dials, fighting through static until finally Cole's voice came through, faint but clear. "Cole here. Everything all right over there?" "Cole, it's Sarah. How's your cabin holding up?" "Solid as a rock. That gap's working like a charm, equalizing the pressure as the storm shifts. Learned about it from some old journals I found when I moved in. Figured the original builders knew something we'd forgotten." Sarah looked around the room at faces that had shifted from skepticism to dawning realization, then back to concern, as another shudder ran through their shelter. The wind's howling had become a living thing, clawing at the mountainside with desperate fury. Inside the Hendersons' cabin, Martha pulled another blanket around her shoulders, but the chill seemed to seep through every layer. The temperature had dropped so dramatically that frost was forming on the inside of their windows, despite the roaring fire Jim kept feeding with their dwindling wood supply. "How much longer can this go on?" Sarah whispered, bouncing little Emma on her lap. The baby had been fussing for hours, sensing the tension that gripped every adult in the room. Jim checked his watch for the 100th time. Radio said the storm system was massive, but this— He gestured helplessly at the walls, which creaked ominously with each gust. "I've never seen anything like it." Through the frost-covered window, they could barely make out the dim outline of Cole's cabin across the clearing. The structure looked impossibly fragile against the white fury surrounding it, yet somehow it remained standing while their own solid log walls groaned under the pressure. "That gap in his wall," Martha said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the storm. "It's got to be letting in snow and wine something fierce." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. From what they could see, Cole's cabin showed no signs of the ice buildup plaguing their own dwelling. No frost climbing the visible exterior walls. No accumulation of snow against the foundation that should have been streaming through that foolish opening. Tom Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been thinking the same thing, remembering his grandfather's stories about the old-timers and their strange building practices. His grandfather had mentioned something once about breathing walls and pressure brakes, but Tom had dismissed it as outdated folklore. Modern insulation and tight construction were superior. Everyone knew that. "Look at his chimney," Sarah said, pointing through the small clear patch Jim had scraped on the window. They all crowded around to peer out. Cole's chimney smoke wasn't being torn away by the wind like theirs was. Instead, it rose in an oddly steady column before dispersing, as if the very air around his cabin moved differently. "That's not possible," Jim muttered, but his conviction wavered. A tremendous crack split the air, and they felt their cabin shudder. One of the support beams in the ceiling had shifted, creating a visible sag in the roofline. Ice was forming along the edges where the roof met the walls, and the weight was becoming dangerous. "We might need to consider," Jim started, then stopped. Consider what? Going outside in this storm meant certain death. But staying in a cabin that might collapse wasn't much better. Martha was studying Cole's place with new eyes. The young man's grandmother, Ellie Brennan, had been born on this mountain. Her family had been among the first settlers, learning to survive in conditions that would have killed most people. What if that gap wasn't a mistake? What if it was intentional? "My father told me once," Tom said slowly, "that the old cabins had what they called spirit holes, places where the mountain could breathe through the building instead of fighting against it." "Spirit holes?" Sarah looked skeptical, but her voice held a note of desperate hope. "Not spirits like ghosts," Tom clarified. "The spirit of the mountain. The way the air moves, the pressure changes." He said fighting the mountain was a fool's game. You had to work with it. Another violent gust hit their cabin, and they heard wood splintering somewhere in the walls. The temperature inside had dropped to the point where they could see their breath, despite the blazing fire that was consuming their wood at an alarming rate. "Cole's not burning as much wood as we are," Martha observed. "Look at his wood pile." She was right. The stack of firewood beside Cole's cabin looked barely touched, while their own supply was nearly exhausted. Yet no one was freezing to death over there. Jim made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "I'm going to make a hole." "Jim, no!" Sarah grabbed his arm. "You'll let the cold in." "The cold's already in," he replied grimly, looking at the ice forming on their walls. "Maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong." He grabbed his axe and approached the wall, facing away from the worst of the wind. Following some half-remembered instinct, he chose a spot about chest-high and began chopping carefully. The others watched in horrified fascination as he created an opening about the size of a dinner plate. The immediate effect was counterintuitive. Instead of a brutal rush of cold air, they felt a subtle change in pressure. The constant creaking of the walls eased slightly, and the ice formation seemed to slow. "I'll be damned," Tom whispered. Through the storm, they caught a glimpse of light in Cole's window, warm and steady. The young man they'd mocked was not only surviving this unprecedented storm, he was comfortable. The wind's fury had reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Cole pressed his ear against the gap in his wall, listening to something beyond the storm's rage, a rhythmic tapping that cut through the chaos like a heartbeat. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short again. "Someone's out there," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Margaret looked up from where she'd been checking on Mrs. Chen, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. "That's impossible. No one could survive in this." But Cole was already moving, his hands working along the gap with practiced familiarity. "It's Morse code, SOS." He paused, listening again. "It's coming from the direction of the Hendricks place." Thomas struggled to his feet, wincing as his injured leg protested. "That's half a mile away. The sound couldn't carry that far, not in this storm." "The gap," Cole said, his voice filled with sudden understanding. "It's not just letting air flow through, it's channeling sound." He turned to face the others, his eyes bright with realization. "My grandfather didn't just know about air pressure. He knew about acoustics, about how sound travels through mountain valleys during storms. The tapping came again, more urgent now, and Cole immediately began responding, using a piece of firewood to tap against the wall. The ancient log seemed to amplify the sound, sending it back out through the gap into the howling wilderness. "You're actually communicating with someone?" Sarah asked, moving closer despite her earlier skepticism. "The old-timers had to have ways to stay connected during storms like this," Cole explained, never stopping his careful tapping. "Before radios, before phones, they couldn't just hope everyone would make it through alone." Margaret watched in amazement as Cole continued his conversation in Morse code, his face growing more serious with each exchange. "What are they saying?" "It's Jim Hendricks. His roof collapsed. He's trapped in what's left of his storm cellar with his daughter and her baby." Cole's voice was grim. "They have maybe an hour of air left." The weight of this news settled over the room like a lead blanket. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, showing no signs of weakening. "We can't reach them," Thomas said flatly. "Even if we knew exactly where they were, we'd die trying to get there." "Maybe we don't have to reach them," Cole said slowly, his mind working. "Maybe we can guide someone else to them." He returned to the gap, this time listening with intense concentration. After several minutes, he began tapping again, longer sequences this time. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "There are other gaps, other old cabins with the same design. I'm trying to reach the Morrison place. It's between us and the Hendricks farm." Cole paused in his tapping. "If this acoustic network really exists, if my grandfather and his generation built it deliberately," the response came faintly, a different rhythm, from a different direction. Cole's face lit up with triumph. "Ben Morrison. He can hear us both." Cole began a complex three-way conversation, tapping out coordinates and instructions with the patience of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance. Margaret found herself holding her breath as she watched this young man, the same one she'd dismissed as careless and unprepared, orchestrate a rescue operation, using methods that predated modern technology by generations. "Ben's got rope and snowshoes," Cole translated. "He thinks he can reach the Hendricks place, but only if someone can guide him through the worst of the wind patterns." "How could anyone possibly—" Thomas began, but Cole was already moving. "The gap doesn't just channel sound out," he said, kneeling beside the opening. "It channels information in. Listen." He guided Thomas's head near the gap, and the older man's eyes widened. "I can hear. The wind patterns are different in different parts of the valley. Grandfather taught me to read them. The old-timers used to navigate by sound during whiteouts." Cole resumed his position at the gap, beginning the most crucial conversation of his life. For the next 40 minutes, he guided Ben Morrison through the treacherous landscape, using nothing but sound, wind patterns, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of mountain dwellers. The others watched in awed silence as Cole painted an audio map of the storm, calling out dangers and safe passages with the confidence of someone reading a familiar book. When the final confirmation came through, 3 strong taps indicating that Ben had reached the Hendricks family and they were safe in his reinforced cabin, the silence in Cole's home was profound. Margaret looked around at the space she had once considered poorly built and dangerous. The gap that had seemed like such a glaring flaw now revealed itself as something else entirely, a lifeline, a communication system, a piece of technology so elegantly integrated into the cabin's design that modern eyes had mistaken it for incompetence. "How many other secrets are hidden in these old places?" she whispered. Outside, the storm continued, but somehow it no longer seemed quite so threatening. The wind had been howling for 3 days now, and Martha Henley could feel the cabin walls shuddering with each violent gust. She pressed her face to the frost-covered window, trying to peer through the whiteout that had swallowed their mountain community whole. The storm had come without warning, catching everyone off guard despite the weather service's predictions of light snow. "Can't see nothing," she muttered to her husband Frank, who was stoking their fireplace with increasingly precious firewood. Not even the Kowalski place, and that's barely 50 yards. Frank grunted, his weathered hands working methodically. They'd been mountain folk for 40 years, had weathered plenty of storms, but this one felt different, angrier. The temperature had plummeted to -20, and their heating system had failed during the first night. Now they were rationing wood and wondering how long their supplies would last. "Should have listened to old Henrik," Frank said, shaking his head. "He kept saying this winter would bite hard." Martha snorted. "Henrik's been predicting the end of the world since Carter was president. Even a broken clock's right twice a day." But privately she was beginning to worry. The storm showed no signs of abating, and they hadn't heard from any of their neighbors since yesterday morning. The phone lines were down, cell towers overwhelmed or damaged. They were completely cut off. Down the mountain, Tom Brennan was having similar thoughts as he watched his generator struggle against the cold. He'd installed it just 2 years ago, proud of the modern heating system that would keep his family comfortable through any weather. Now the machine coughed and wheezed like an old man climbing stairs, and Tom knew it wouldn't last much longer. "Dad, I'm cold," his daughter Sophie whispered from beneath a pile of blankets. She was 12, too young to understand the gravity of their situation, but old enough to sense her parents' growing anxiety. Tom forced a smile. "Just a little longer, sweetheart. The storm will pass soon." But he didn't believe it himself. Through his kitchen window, he could barely make out the shape of Cole's cabin higher up the slope. The young man had become something of a local joke over the past year with his eccentric modifications to the old structure. Tom had joined in the gentle mockery, shaking his head at Cole's seemingly random carpentry projects. Now, squinting through the snow, he noticed something odd. While every other visible building in the valley appeared dark and battened down, there seemed to be a steady, warm light emanating from Cole's place. Not the flickering glow of a fireplace or the harsh glare of emergency lighting, but something else entirely. 3 miles away, Sarah Chen was discovering that her expensive insulation and state-of-the-art windows meant nothing when the power grid failed completely. Her modern cabin, featured in a home design magazine just last spring, had become a beautifully appointed icebox. She huddled with her teenage son Jake around a camping stove, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Mom, what if the storm doesn't stop?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. Sarah pulled him closer, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "It will, honey. It has to." But the wind outside seemed to mock her optimism, screaming through the mountain passes with prehistoric fury. She thought about Cole, wondered how the young man was faring in his ramshackle cabin. She'd always assumed he was something of a dreamer, nice enough but impractical. His strange construction projects had been a source of neighborhood amusement for months. As if summoned by her thoughts, a figure appeared through the storm. Sarah gasped, pressing her face to the window. Someone was actually moving through the blizzard, trudging through snow that reached their thighs. The figure wore what looked like crude snowshoes and was wrapped in layers of clothing, but they moved with purpose and surprising ease. A knock at her door made her jump. She opened it carefully, and Cole's frost-covered face greeted her through the gap. "Sarah? You and Jake okay?" She stared at him in amazement. "Cole, how are you even outside? It's a whiteout." "I know. Listen, you need to come with me, both of you. Bring whatever warm clothes you can carry, but we need to move fast." "What? Why?" Cole's expression was grave. "Because this storm's going to get worse before it gets better, and your place isn't going to keep you alive much longer. I've got room at my cabin, and it's warm." Sarah hesitated. The idea of venturing outside in this weather seemed insane, but looking at Cole's confident demeanor, his obvious comfort in conditions that terrified her, she began to reconsider everything she thought she knew about her eccentric neighbor. "How do you know we'll make it?" Cole smiled grimly. "Because sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones. Trust me." The wind had died to an eerie whisper by dawn, but nobody in the shelter dared move. Outside, the world had transformed into something alien and hostile. Through the gap that had saved their lives, Cole could see snow piled nearly to the cabin's eaves, creating a white wall that blocked most of the windows. "Jesus," Frank whispered, his voice hoarse from the night's ordeal. "How much snow is out there?" Cole pressed his face to the opening, studying the strange blue-white landscape. 8 feet, maybe more. The drifts against the north side looked twice that. Martha stirred from where she'd been huddled against the far wall, her designer jacket now wrinkled and stained. "When will the roads be clear? I have a conference call tomorrow. Today, I mean." The question hung in the air like smoke. Cole exchanged glances with old Pete, who was methodically checking his fingers for frostbite. They both knew what Martha didn't want to hear. "Ma'am," Pete said gently, "ain't no roads going to be clear for days. Maybe a week or more, depending on how the wind redistributed all that snow. That's impossible. This is the 21st century. They have equipment. Equipment that's buried under the same snow we are," Frank interrupted, surprising everyone with his bluntness. The near-death experience seemed to have stripped away his usual corporate politeness. "Look around, Martha. We're not in the city anymore." Cole moved away from the gap, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When the mountain tests you, son, you don't fight it. You work with it. Find the path it's willing to give you." "We need to dig out," he announced. "Not completely, but enough to access my storage shed and the main cabin. There's food and better supplies there." "Dig out?" Martha looked incredulous. "With what? Our hands?" "I've got tools," Cole said. "Emergency cache near the door. Grandad always said to keep digging implements close to every exit." He paused, remembering all the times he'd questioned the old man's seemingly paranoid preparations. "Guess I know why now." Sarah, who'd been quiet since dawn, spoke up. "What about the others? Your neighbors down the valley?" Cole's stomach tightened. The Hendersons lived in a newer cabin, built to modern codes but without the old-fashioned storm preparations. The Martinez family had just moved up from Phoenix 6 months ago, drawn by remote work opportunities and mountain views. Neither household would have the deep root cellars, the reinforced storm shelters, or the cached supplies that came standard in the old mountain families. "We'll check on them once we get mobile," he said, though privately he wondered what they'd find. Pete struggled to his feet, joints creaking audibly. "That wind last night, I never seen anything like it, and I've been on this mountain 47 years, sounded like a freight train having a tantrum." "Climate change," Martha muttered, but without her usual conviction. "Maybe," Cole said, pulling on his boots. "Or maybe just the mountain reminding us who's really in charge." He began carefully excavating the emergency cache he'd installed just inside the door. Another of his grandfather's insisted upon modifications that had seemed excessive at the time. His fingers found the familiar handles of the folding shovels, the ice axes, the rope, everything wrapped in waterproof tarp and sealed in a metal container that had seemed like overkill when he'd installed it 3 years ago. Frank watched him work with growing amazement. "You really did think of everything, didn't you?" "Not me," Cole said, unwrapping the tools. 3 generations of winter survivors. Every weird modification to this place, every seemingly crazy preparation, it all came from someone who lived through something that taught them better. He handed Frank one of the shovels, then offered another to Sarah. "We start slow, work in shifts. The snow's probably settled some, but it'll still be heavy, and we need to be careful about undermining the drifts above us." "What about me?" Martha asked, and Cole was surprised to hear genuine willingness in her voice instead of entitlement. "You and Pete can inventory what we've got for supplies, plan out rationing if we need it." He looked directly at her. "This might be a while, Martha. We need to think like survivors, not like people waiting for rescue." As Cole began the careful work of digging toward the surface, he found himself thinking about the gap in the wall, the ridiculous, embarrassing flaw that had become their salvation. How many other pieces of mountain wisdom had he dismissed or ignored? How many shortcuts had he taken in his modern life that could have cost him everything? The shovel bit into the packed snow, each scoop bringing them closer to the surface and to whatever remained of their world outside. Behind him, he could hear Martha and Pete quietly discussing food stores, their voices carrying a new note of cooperation that would have been impossible just 12 hours ago. Sometimes it took nearly dying to remember how to truly live. The wind had died to whispers, but Thomas Brennan couldn't shake the feeling that they were still trapped in something far larger than a storm. He sat cross-legged on Cole's cabin floor, watching the young man tend to Ezra's frostbitten fingers with surprising skill. The gap in the wall that had saved them all seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, drawing cold air in and warm air out in perfect balance. "How did you know?" Sarah finally asked, breaking the silence that had settled over them like fresh snow. "About the gap, I mean. Nobody builds walls like that anymore." Cole's hands paused in their careful ministrations. His eyes found the weathered timber above the gap, where generations of smoke had darkened the wood to charcoal. "My great-grandfather built this place. Before he died, he told me stories about the mountain's moods, said she was like a woman scorned, beautiful but deadly when crossed." Margaret shifted closer to the fire, her designer jacket now torn and stained beyond recognition. "But that doesn't explain the wall. We all thought you were just inexperienced." A bitter laugh escaped Cole's throat. "Maybe I am, but inexperienced doesn't mean ignorant." He resumed wrapping Ezra's fingers with strips torn from his own shirt. "Great-grandfather said the mountain breathes. In storms like this, she holds her breath until something gives. Houses get crushed under snow loads, foundations crack, people suffocate in their own shelters." Thomas felt his engineering mind racing, trying to reconcile Cole's words with everything he thought he knew about structural design. The gap acts as a pressure valve. More than that. Cole secured the makeshift bandage and sat back on his heels. "Watch the smoke." They all turned toward the fire. The smoke rose straight up from the flames, then caught an invisible current near the ceiling and flowed toward the gap in smooth, steady streams. But Thomas noticed something else. Fresh air seemed to enter through the gap's lower portion, while the smoke exited through its upper reaches. "Thermal differential," he whispered. "But how could your great-grandfather have known about thermodynamics?" Cole's smile held no warmth. He didn't call it that. He just said the mountain needed to breathe through the house, or the house would die. He stood and walked to a wooden chest near his bed. From it he withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. He wrote everything down. Every storm, every survival technique, every mistake that killed people. The journal fell open in Cole's hands, to a page covered in careful handwriting and rough sketches. "February 1887, he read aloud. "Lost the Henderson family to the pride of modern building. Sealed their house tight as a drum. Found them 3 days later, blue as winter sky. The mountain had pressed their breath back into their lungs until they drowned in their own air." Margaret's face had gone pale. "That's impossible!" "Is it?" Dr. Chen spoke for the first time in an hour, her voice hoarse. "We know about air pressure differentials. In a storm this intense, with rapid temperature changes..." She trailed off, but Thomas could see her mind working through the physics. Cole flipped through more pages, each one filled with observations that would have seemed like folklore just hours ago. Now they read like survival manuals written in blood and bitter experience. Here's one from 1923. "Family sealed every crack in their cabin, burned a huge fire to stay warm. Carbon monoxide poisoning took them all. The gap isn't just about pressure, it's about air exchange." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. Every modern principle of energy efficiency, every technique he'd learned about creating airtight building envelopes would have killed them tonight. Cole's seemingly primitive construction had incorporated ventilation principles that took modern science decades to rediscover. "But why didn't you explain?" Sarah's voice carried a note of accusation. "When we were criticizing your work, why didn't you tell us?" Cole's laugh held decades of accumulated frustration. "Would you have listened? When I mentioned traditional techniques, you called them backwards. When I said the old-timers knew things we'd forgotten, Margaret suggested I take some engineering courses. He closed the journal gently. Some knowledge can only be earned, not taught. The wind picked up again outside, but it no longer sounded threatening. It sounded like conversation. The mountains speaking in a language Cole's family had never forgotten how to understand. Ezra stirred from his semi-conscious state, his fever-bright eyes focusing on Cole's face. "Boy," he wheezed, "I owe you more than an apology." "You don't owe me anything," Cole replied, but his voice carried satisfaction. "Just remember this night when the storm passes. Remember what saved us." Thomas stared at the gap in the wall with new understanding. It wasn't a flaw in construction. It was a masterpiece of environmental engineering disguised as rustic simplicity. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a troubling question began to form. What other traditional wisdom had they dismissed as primitive ignorance? The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the storm itself. Cole pressed his eye to the gap in his cabin wall, watching as his neighbors emerged from their homes like survivors crawling from wreckage. The snow had drifted so high against some doors that people had to climb out through windows. But it wasn't the snow that made his stomach clench with dread. It was what the storm had revealed. Martha Henderson stood beside the fallen giant, her face pale as she pointed to something Cole couldn't see from his position. Other neighbors gathered around her, their voices carrying across the crystalline air in sharp fragments of disbelief. "Impossible," he heard Tom Brady shout. "That tree was solid as bedrock." Cole pulled on his boots and coat, his grandfather's journal tucked safely in his inner pocket. The gap in his wall had saved more than just his life last night. It had opened his eyes to something far more troubling than a simple structural flaw. Outside, the cold bit at his cheeks as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the crowd. As he approached, the circle of neighbors parted slightly, their expressions mixing curiosity with the same grudging respect they'd shown him since the storm began. Martha looked up as he joined them, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or cold, he couldn't tell which. "Cole, you need to see this." She led him around the massive root system, now exposed and twisted skyward like the fingers of some buried giant. But it wasn't the roots that made Cole's blood run cold, it was what lay beneath them. A perfect rectangular depression in the earth, lined with stones worn smooth by time. Inside the depression, partially crushed by the tree's fall, lay the remnants of what had once been a wooden structure. Even through the destruction, Cole could make out the deliberate craftsmanship, the careful joinery that spoke of old mountain-building techniques. "There was another cabin here," whispered Sarah Chen, voicing what everyone could see but no one wanted to believe. "Before any of us, before the tree." Cole knelt beside the ruins, his heart hammering as he recognized the construction style. It matched descriptions from his grandfather's journal perfectly. The same techniques, the same attention to natural wind patterns and drainage. His hands shook as he brushed snow from a partially intact wall section. There, carved deep into the wood, despite decades of decay, was a symbol he'd memorized from the journal's pages, a simple gap deliberately cut with wind lines flowing through it. "How old do you think that tree was?" asked Elena Vasquez, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom Brady, who prided himself on knowing every tree in the valley, stared at the massive trunk with growing unease. 150 years, maybe more, but that would mean that someone was building with these techniques long before any of our families arrived, Cole finished, standing slowly. Someone who understood things about these mountains that we've forgotten. The implications settled over the group like another kind of storm. Their modernized cabins, their improved construction methods, their dismissal of old-fashioned building practices, all of it suddenly seemed like arrogance in the face of knowledge that had been tested by more than a century of mountain weather. Martha's voice cracked as she spoke. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old builders, said they knew secrets about reading the mountain's moods. I thought they were just fairy tales." Cole pulled the journal from his pocket, its leather cover worn smooth by his grandfather's hands, and now his own. They weren't fairy tales. They were lessons. He opened to a page he'd studied countless times, showing detailed diagrams of cabin construction with specific notes about wind flow and pressure release. The same principles that had guided him in creating his wall gap, the same understanding that had kept him alive while the storm raged. "Your grandfather knew about this place?" Sarah asked, staring at the journal with new respect. "He knew about the principles," Cole replied. "But I think this," he gestured to the ancient foundation, "this is proof that the knowledge goes back much further than we imagined. The mountains have been teaching the same lessons for generations. We just stopped listening." A gust of wind swept through the valley, whistling through the broken tree with an almost mournful sound. Cole looked back toward his own cabin, where his deliberately flawed wall stood as both shelter and symbol. The gap wasn't a mistake or an eccentricity. It was a continuation of wisdom that had survived when everything else had fallen, and now, standing among the ruins of knowledge lost and found again, he understood that his real test wasn't surviving the storm. It was ensuring this wisdom would never be buried again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-drifted clearing as Elena stepped carefully through the knee-deep powder toward Cole's cabin. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and each step crunched with the particular sound that only came after a storm of such magnitude. Behind her, Marcus struggled to keep pace, his city boots wholly inadequate for the treacherous terrain. "I still don't understand how that gap in his wall could have made any difference," Marcus muttered, adjusting his grip on the emergency medical kit they'd brought from the main lodge. "Basic physics says heat escapes through openings." Elena paused, turning to study the young architect's face. Even after everything they'd witnessed during the storm, he remained stubbornly anchored to his textbook understanding of the world. "Sometimes, Marcus, the mountains teach lessons that can't be found in engineering manuals." The cabin came into view, smoke still rising steadily from its chimney. What struck Elena most was how utterly normal it appeared, as if the previous night's life-and-death struggle had been nothing more than a vivid dream. Yet she could still feel the phantom ache in her lungs from breathing the superheated air that had nearly claimed them all. Cole emerged from behind the structure, carrying an armload of firewood. His movements were steady and purposeful, showing no signs of the ordeal they'd all endured. When he spotted his approaching visitors, he set down the wood and waited, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Morning, Cole," Elena called out, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there in years of previous encounters. "We wanted to check on you, make sure you were all right after last night." The old mountain man nodded slowly, his pale eyes shifting between Elena and Marcus. "Storm's past, we're all still breathing. Reckon that counts for something." Marcus stepped forward, his scientific mind clearly still wrestling with unanswered questions. "Cole, I need to understand what happened in there. That gap in your wall, it shouldn't have worked the way it did. The principles of thermodynamics suggest—" "Principles," Cole interrupted quietly, the word carrying decades of accumulated wisdom. "You young folks always talking about principles, like they're the only truth worth knowing." He gestured toward the vast expanse of wilderness surrounding them. "These mountains been here longer than your principles. They got their own ways of doing things." Elena found herself studying the cabin's exterior with new eyes, searching for clues she'd previously dismissed. The structure appeared deceptively simple, yet she was beginning to understand that its apparent crudeness might actually represent a sophisticated adaptation to conditions that modern engineering had never properly considered. "My grandfather built this place," Cole continued, running his gnarled hand along the cabin's weathered logs. "His grandfather taught him how. Wasn't no accident where that gap got placed, or how big it needed to be. Mountain families been surviving storms like last night for generations before anyone thought to write down formulas about heat and air." Marcus shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "But there has to be a scientific explanation. Air pressure differentials, thermal dynamics, something measurable and reproducible." Cole's expression softened slightly, as if he were looking at a confused child rather than a grown man with multiple degrees. Of course, there's explanations. Just because your books don't contain them doesn't mean they ain't real. He pointed toward the seemingly random placement of the cabin relative to the surrounding trees and rock formations. Every piece of this place got positioned for reasons. Wind patterns, snow load distribution, thermal currents that change with the seasons. Elena began to see it then. The invisible architecture of survival that Cole's ancestors had mapped through trial, error, and careful observation across countless winters. What appeared to be simple folk knowledge actually represented a complex understanding of environmental systems that predated modern meteorology by centuries. "The gap creates a pressure release," she said suddenly, the realization dawning. "Not just for heat, but for the entire air circulation system inside the cabin. During extreme conditions, it prevents the dangerous buildup we experienced in the lodge." Cole nodded approvingly. "Air needs somewhere to go. Push it too hard in one direction, it'll find ways to push back, sometimes violently." Marcus remained silent for a long moment, his worldview clearly undergoing fundamental reconstruction. Finally, he looked up at Cole with something approaching humility. "Would you teach me? Really teach me how this works?" The old mountain man studied the young architect carefully, as if weighing the sincerity of the request. "Learning ain't just about understanding, son. It's about respecting what you don't understand yet." He paused, glancing toward the peaks that rose majestically around them. Mountains got patience for folks willing to listen, but they got no mercy for those who think they already know everything. Elena watched this exchange with growing recognition that last night had changed more than just their chances of survival. Something fundamental had shifted in the delicate relationship between tradition and progress, between ancient wisdom and modern certainty. The storm's fury had finally begun to subside, but the revelations inside Cole's cabin continued to reverberate through the gathered neighbors. Martha Henley sat in stunned silence, her weathered hands trembling as she processed what old Henrik had just told them about the ancient breathing walls and the mountain's own ventilation system. "My grandfather never told me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the dying wind. "All those years of stories about the old country, about survival in the mountains, and he never mentioned this." Henrik's pale eyes reflected the firelight as he studied her face. Perhaps he thought the knowledge was lost forever. Many secrets died with the generation that came before us. He gestured toward the gap in Cole's wall, where the steady flow of fresh air continued to circulate through the cabin. "Your grandson rediscovered something that took our ancestors generations to perfect." Cole shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd accidentally stumbled upon. "I just thought the cabin felt stuffy. I never imagined—" "That's exactly how it should be," Henrik interrupted gently. "The best survival techniques feel natural, instinctive. You sensed what the mountain was trying to teach you." Outside, the wind had dropped from its earlier howling to intermittent gusts that rattled the shutters, but no longer threatened to tear the cabin apart. Tom Bradley stood and moved to one of the windows, peering through a crack in the boards. "Snow's still falling, but not like before," he reported. "Visibility's improving slightly." Dr. Sarah Chen checked her watch and frowned. "We've been here almost 18 hours. My husband will be worried sick, but I don't think the roads will be passable for at least another day." "The roads will wait," Henrik said firmly. "But this conversation cannot. There are other things you need to understand about mountain survival, things that might save lives in the future." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather. It's written in Norwegian, but I've been translating it slowly over the years." Martha leaned forward eagerly. "What does it say?" "Many things about reading the mountain's moods, about understanding when storms approach not just by clouds and wind, but by how the trees bend, how animals behave, how the very rock seems to whisper warnings." Henrik's fingers traced the worn leather cover, but most importantly, it talks about harmony with the mountain rather than conquest of it. Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. You mean there are other things, like the breathing walls? Oh yes, Henrik nodded gravely. Building positioning to avoid avalanche paths that might not be obvious, water sources that never freeze, even in the harshest winters, signs in the stone itself that indicate which areas are stable during earthquakes. Tom returned to his seat, his expression troubled. If this knowledge exists, why isn't it being shared? Why aren't we teaching these things? Because modern building codes and engineering principles don't account for traditional wisdom, Dr. Chen said slowly, her scientific mind wrestling with the implications. We've become so focused on technology and standardized solutions that we've forgotten to listen to the accumulated knowledge of people who lived here for centuries. Henrik opened the journal carefully, revealing pages covered in precise handwriting and detailed sketches. Look at these drawings. They show not just how to build breathing walls, but entire ventilation systems that work with natural air currents, methods for predicting weather patterns weeks in advance, techniques for finding water during drought. Martha studied the sketches with growing amazement. These aren't primitive methods, they're sophisticated engineering based on deep observation and understanding. Exactly, Henrik confirmed. But they require patience, observation, and respect for natural systems, things that are often sacrificed for speed and cost efficiency in modern construction. Cole stood and walked to the gap in his wall, placing his hand near the opening to feel the gentle flow of air. So when I made this hole, I wasn't just improving ventilation. I was tapping into something much larger. A system that the mountain itself helped create over thousands of years, Henrik explained. The rock formations, the wind patterns, the way water flows underground, it all works together. Your cabin sits at precisely the right location to access this natural network. Dr. Chen was taking notes in her phone, her medical training shifting into documentation mode. This has implications far beyond just mountain cabins. If we could study and understand these principles, we could revolutionize how we think about sustainable building, Tom finished, his contractor's mind already racing with possibilities. The fire crackled peacefully in the hearth, and for the first time since the storm began, the cabin felt truly safe rather than merely protective. The breathing wall continued its steady work, and the neighbors found themselves looking at young Cole with a mixture of respect and wonder. Outside, the mountain kept its ancient vigil, holding secrets yet to be discovered by those wise enough to listen. The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, and the silence that followed felt almost sacred after the fury of the night. Cole stood at his peculiar gap in the wall, watching the first pale light filter through the settling snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under drifts that reached the eaves of some cabins, sculpted into impossible curves by the relentless wind. Behind him, the survivors stirred slowly. Martha was the first to speak, her voice hoarse from the night's ordeal. "Dear God," she whispered, pressing her face to one of Cole's windows. "Look at the Henderson's place." Cole turned to see what had captured her attention. Where Jim Henderson's meticulously sealed cabin had stood, only the roof peak was visible above a massive drift. The perfect insulation and weatherproofing that Jim had been so proud of had created a trap, with no way for the warm air to escape and melt the accumulating snow. The building had been completely buried. "We need to dig them out," Frank said, already reaching for his coat. "Wait." Cole held up a hand. "Listen." They all strained their ears. From the direction of the buried cabin came a rhythmic tapping. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. "SOS, they're alive," Betty breathed. "But for how long?" Cole was already moving, gathering shovels and rope from his shed. "The snow will be unstable after a storm like this. We'll need to be careful not to cause a collapse." As they worked their way toward the Henderson cabin, more neighbors emerged from wherever they had found shelter. The Kowalskis had survived in their root cellar, but their main cabin was damaged beyond repair. The Yamadas had weathered the storm in their reinforced storm shelter, emerging shaken but unharmed. But it was when they reached the Morrison place that the true scope of the disaster became clear. The elderly couple's cabin, built to modern specifications with energy-efficient windows and perfect insulation, was not just buried, it was gone. The roof had collapsed under the weight of snow that had accumulated faster than the minimal heat loss could melt it. Frank fell to his knees in the snow. "Ben? Helen?" he called out, his voice breaking. Cole placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Frank, I'm sorry. The collapse happened hours ago during the worst of the storm. There was nothing anyone could have done." As the grim reality settled over them, more revelations emerged. Every cabin built to modern standards had either been buried or destroyed. Every family that had survived had either taken shelter in Cole's seemingly flawed cabin or had their own version of his foolish gap. The Yamadas' storm shelter had deliberately poor insulation and ventilation holes. The Kowalskis' root cellar had strategic air leaks that had prevented dangerous accumulation. "I don't understand," Jim Henderson said when they finally dug him and his family out. His face was grey with cold and exhaustion. "Our cabin was perfectly sealed. How did yours stay clear?" Cole looked around at the circle of faces, some grateful, some confused, all of them changed by the night's events. "My grandfather built this cabin, and his grandfather taught him. They knew something we forgot." He led them back to his cabin, pointing to the gap that had seemed so foolish just hours before. In storms, like last night's, the snow doesn't just fall, it hunts. It finds every warm surface, every place where heat meets cold, and it builds there. A perfectly sealed cabin becomes a beacon, drawing the snow like a magnet. Martha shook her head slowly. "But that gap, it must let out so much heat." "It does," Cole agreed. "But look." He pointed to the area directly around the gap, where the snow was notably thinner. "The heat doesn't just escape, it creates a pattern. It melts and shifts the snow in specific ways. The old-timers called it teaching the storm to flow around you instead of over you." Frank was examining the gap more closely now, running his fingers along the carefully shaped opening. "This isn't random, is it? The size, the angle, it's all deliberate." "Every measurement came from my great-grandfather's notes. The gap has to be exactly the right size for the cabin's volume, positioned at precisely the right angle for the prevailing winds. Too small, and you get burial. Too large, and you freeze. But get it right." He gestured at his intact cabin, surrounded by clear ground. "We thought we were smarter than our ancestors," Betty said quietly. "With our modern materials and engineering, we are smarter in many ways," Cole replied. "But wisdom isn't the same as intelligence. Wisdom is intelligence aged by experience, passed down through generations who lived and died by their understanding of this mountain." As they stood in the growing daylight, surveying the destruction around Cole's island of survival, the weight of what they had learned settled over them. The mountain had taught them a lesson written in snow and wind, carved by tragedy and measured in lives lost and saved. The old ways weren't backwards, they were warnings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered clearing as the rescue helicopters finally departed, their rotors fading into distant whispers against the mountain peaks. Cole stood beside the remains of his cabin, watching the last of his neighbors being loaded onto stretchers, alive, breathing, saved by what they had once called his foolishness. Martha Henley, wrapped in thermal blankets but refusing the stretcher, approached him with unsteady steps. Her weathered face bore the marks of frostbite, but her eyes held something Cole had never seen there before: humility. "That gap in your wall," she said, her voice hoarse from the ordeal. "My grandfather used to talk about something like that, called it a wind door. I thought it was just old superstition." Cole nodded, running his hand along the charred timber where his carefully constructed opening had channeled the deadly gases away from them all. "My great-uncle Ezra taught me about it when I was 12, said the mountain would tell me when I needed it, but I'd have to listen with more than my ears." Thomas Wheeler joined them, limping slightly but determined to walk on his own power. The man who had petitioned to have Cole's building permits revoked now stared at the cabin's remains with something approaching reverence. "The way you positioned it," Thomas said, shaking his head. "It wasn't random, was it? You calculated the wind patterns, the thermal dynamics." "Not calculated," Cole corrected gently. "Felt, watched. The old-timers didn't have computers or weather stations, but they had generations of observation. They knew how this mountain breathes." Sarah Chen, the young engineer who had been most vocal about Cole's backward construction methods, sat on a fallen log nearby. Her laptop bag, somehow salvaged from the chaos, lay beside her, but she made no move to open it. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice small against the vast mountain silence. "About the mountain having its own logic. I designed my cabin to withstand everything I could calculate, but I never thought to ask what the mountain itself might teach me." Cole crouched down to examine a section of his foundation that had somehow survived the inferno. The stones his great-uncle had helped him place were still perfectly fitted, their surfaces barely scorched, despite the intense heat that had consumed everything around them. "These rocks came from this exact spot," he explained. "Uncle Ezra said the mountain would provide what it wanted us to use, but only if we paid attention to where things belonged. These stones had been here for maybe 1,000 years. They knew how to survive what the mountain could throw at them." Old Henrik Larsson, the only neighbor who had never openly criticized Cole's methods, shuffled over to join the group. Despite being in his 80s, he had weathered the night better than most of the younger residents. "My father came here from Norway in 1923, Henrik said, his accented English carrying clearly in the crisp air. "He used to say that in the old country, the mountains taught the people how to live with them, not against them. When I saw what young Cole was doing, I remembered those words." Martha touched the stone foundation reverently. "We all got so caught up in building the strongest walls, the most airtight seals, the most modern systems. We forgot that sometimes you need to let the mountain in a little bit." "The gap wasn't about letting the mountain in," Cole said, straightening up. "It was about respecting that the mountain was already here. My cabin wasn't separate from this place, it was part of it. That's why when the fire came, when the gases built up, the mountain had a way to protect us all." A helicopter appeared on the horizon, coming back for the final evacuation run. Cole knew they would want him to leave too, to get checked out at the hospital, to file reports and answer questions about how 7 people had survived what should have been certain death. But as he watched his neighbors, former critics turned believers, gathering their few salvaged belongings, Cole realized the mountain had taught them all something more valuable than any building technique or survival method. It had shown them that wisdom didn't always come from textbooks or modern innovations. Sometimes it came from listening to voices that had been whispering truths for generations. "We'll rebuild," Thomas said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. Cole looked around the clearing, at the blackened stumps and the pristine snow beyond, at the peaks that had watched over his family for 4 generations. "Yes," he said, "but maybe this time we'll ask the mountain what it thinks first." The helicopter's rotors grew louder as it descended, ready to carry them all away from this place of destruction and revelation. But Cole knew they would return, and when they did, they would build differently. They would build with respect, with humility, and with the hard-earned knowledge that sometimes the old ways held truths that no amount of modern thinking could replace. The mountain had spoken, and finally, they had all learned how to listen.